guys, welcome to episode 75 of Accidents on Trial. I still can't believe it's been done many already. Today I'm bringing back Bryan. He's been on a couple of times already, and we've always had really good conversations. We're going to talk about religion, the nature of beliefs, how we both ground our morality, given that we're both more realists, but obviously from different backgrounds. And if you guys are having any trouble hearing me or anything like that, just let me know in the comments. But yeah, I'm gonna bring him in. There we go.
Hey.
Sweet. Hey, thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy conversations like this because I'll tell you, living in the Bible Belt, kind of critical conversations about religious grounding and all sorts of things are not easy to have, and so I always love the opportunity to get on here and talk about some things there. Not things that I usually get to talk about. And so definitely appreciate the opportunity to get on here. And I've always enjoyed both you and J Mike and your perspectives and your willingness to listen and entertain ideas. I think that's always the mark of somebody who's a good conversation partner, who can entertain your ideas without accepting them. And so it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I try to kind of engage these conversations in good faith. I think sometimes some of the people that I've had on, it's not always been easy to do that with.
Yeah.
But I definitely appreciate your side of it as well. I think you're probably one of the few theist, I guess I can say theist.
Yeah, that's fair. Agnostic theist.
Yeah, that I legitimately have respect for. That's not something that I respect people as human beings, but often it's hard for me to kind of intellectually respect religious people when I have certain types of conversations with them, because usually I'm met with, I know this to be true. And I know it to be true because I know that I have this relationship with this thing, and it's usually that kind of arrogance that is really hard for me to deal with.
Yeah. Arrogance is the right word to use. I mean, we were talking right before the show about some interactions that we've had on TikTok with that sort of thing, and. You can share what it was about. I don't really remember what thing it was about that you saw that comment I did on.
Yeah, so I had this guy on maybe like a couple months ago. I'm really bad with time, but his whole thing was that somehow he believes that the fact that the world, according to his words, submits to a 7-day calendar, and that this was predicted by the Bible, is like proof of God.
Yeah, that is
and it's like there's nothing. I mean, even if that was true, which that the whole world submits to this thing, which it doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But even if it was true, there was no logical connection between that and God being real. And it was like, well, produce who started this. Like, I don't have to produce that. It's like we know that we've observed movements being started by human beings. I am yet to observe anything miraculous. So it's
well, and even with that argument, right? With the world moved towards a 7-day calendar, therefore God. Well, also the world moved towards a calendar honoring pagans. So does that mean that the pagan gods are also real? We have Thor's Day and Mars, and we have so many different. It proves nothing. But I get why they do it. They want to try and pin down different aspects to try and feel justified, and I get that. I think we all want to feel justified, um, but that's definitely not the way to go about it. What really irks me about people like that is when you call them on their crap, they they uh, they double down instead of taking the moment to say, well, maybe I'm wrong about this thing that I thought I was sure about.
Well,
Um,
I mean, that's the thing that drives me crazy. Is like even when I showed him examples of tribes that actually don't abide by the calendar, and then instead of being like, because first he was using the term universal, which would mean applying to everybody.
sure.
Then when I showed him that there are tribes that don't, then he changed it to, well, it's the countries that they live in that abide by the calendar.
Yeah,
And
because countries are a metaphysical concept that has
right,
ontological reality. Yeah,
it,
no.
it's just it's just a level of delusion met with this like
Yeah.
arrogance, where like suddenly I'm desperate because I'm bringing up examples that completely counter. Uh, so that kind of person, I don't enjoy talking with
No,
because
yeah.
it's a
Well,
waste of
and
time.
uh, it's one of those things where I don't. It's very rare that you'll argue somebody out of fundamentalism. I'm not going to say it's
Yeah,
impossible, but
right.
it is very, very rare because they haven't formed their self in a way that is open.
Right.
And there's stuff that kind of leads into what we're going to be talking about probably a little bit tonight about uh, what in the world is religion and what function does it serve or should it serve and all that
Sure.
sort of thing.
Yeah, so I guess let's start there. Well, first, actually, for those that might not know you, maybe give a little bit of your
Oh yeah,
background.
sorry, I completely forgot to do that.
I
Yeah,
forgot to. No,
so
of course.
yeah, my name is Brian. I am a Christian pastor. I live in Texas, and I approach the Christian faith through kind of an existential mystic lens, and uh, because of that, uh, I look at Christian faith as not really some sort of propositional worldview, but instead as a critique of a worldview. Um, Very much like an atheist might call themselves. They don't have a worldview. They have a critique of a particular worldview.
Right.
Um, and so I that's kind of the way I approach things. Um, and uh, I have been a Christian minister for 10 years, and uh, we talk about deconstruction all the time. I deconstructed from kind of a fundamentalist background myself, and so I actually I dedicate my life. That's what I do to helping uh, people do that for themselves, to come out of a place of kind of that arrogant certainty and come to in a place where we can really kind of encounter each other and really grow and learn. And so that's kind of what I'm about.
That's great. Yeah, and I remember the first time you were here, we had an interesting conversation about kind of how you define this concept of God as kind of very different. It's not like this, entity in the clouds, but
Yeah.
it's more like this existential, almost like moment created by the interaction between people, right? You were saying something along
Yeah,
those
there's something.
lines.
Yeah, so there's I I think this might go into when we get to the moral reasoning.
Yeah.
Because we said something in one of our conversations, and we were trying to pin down is like, what exactly am I talking about when I'm talking about God? And part of the issue is I don't really know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about God. I just
Right.
I try and figure it out. But I think it might have been you, or it might have been no, it was you. You had asked, um, if there were no human minds, right? Would God exist? And I said, to me, that's very similar. There's a similar question to saying is if there were no conscious minds, would goodness exist, or the concept of morality exist? I think it's a wrong it's the wrong kind of question.
Right, right.
Um, and uh, and so we've talked about God in a lot of different ways, but what I definitely can say with certainty is that God is not a thing that exists out there, and that puts me in a difficult spot when I talk to a lot of fundamentalists, because we're coming at things from a very different point
Yeah, very different.
from the get go. But yeah, I don't want to rehash everything we've talked about on that, but that's kind of
No, but I think that's a good kind of way to frame everything in the conversation. You had mentioned wanting to talk about like sort of this concept of religion,
yeah.
which to me seems is such a kind of vague word.
Well, yeah, and that's a problem with the word religion, right? Um, you know, uh, William Kavanaugh, who is a scholar of religion, actually argues that there is no definition of religion. That um, any time we try and define religion, we either do so broadly that it includes things that we probably wouldn't recognize as religion, or we do so narrowly that we exclude things that call themselves religion.
It's kind of like the word sport, right? Like
Yeah,
you can
yeah,
have a
it's
sport like I don't know, like a ping pong and a sport like mixed martial arts, and like they're both sports, right? But they're so fundamentally different
yeah,
that it's kind of weird to compare.
yeah. Well, it's a lot like, for instance, um, if you want to talk about uh, religion as, religion is this thing that worships a deity. Well, Buddhism doesn't have any deities, and we recognize that as religion. Or um, you have things like, uh, you might say, well, it's something that has ritual and uh, devotion, and it's like, well, that encompasses being a fan of like BTS. There's all sorts of stuff and we use sometimes religious fervor for like people who are mega fans of a like a pop group or something.
I don't know what BTS is.
Oh, it's a Korean pop thing.
Oh,
It's fine. Um, but yeah, so like we have uh, so many different things that so many factors that it's hard to define. And so what scholars of religion now say is that religion is just kind of discursively defined, that there's no like one definition of religion. It's just like we define it as we talk about it, which is very
right.
annoying.
Yeah, yeah.
And uh, the the thing that I want to talk about with religion is, oftentimes when I hear in non-scholarly discussion about religion, in kind of just like day-to-day conversation, a lot of people will conflate religion basically with um, kind of non-empirical thinking. That you have religious thought, and then you have rational thought.
Right.
And I get why that's done. But I think that that's rooted in a kind of a problematic thing that is rooted in the study of religion itself. The study of religion arose in basically white Protestants starting to encounter other religions, and they wanted to kind of understand their otherness, and they imposed religious categories on tribal religions and cultures, and so uh, we tend to think of religion as a belief system with certain propositions that are either true or false, and that's a religious system. But a lot of religious systems don't work like that. Um, when we when I think about religion, and when I think about uh, how these things operate, I think more in terms of not propositions, like a propositional belief system, but instead of uh, instead a system of practices, and that is a very different idea. Um, for instance, uh, a religious person can be religious uh, even if they don't hold to a specific worldview. If they come home and drop a little incense on a ball on a burning altar as kind of a ritualistic thing, to where they pattern their lives in a certain way and try and orient their mind. Meditation is a religious exercise.
It's a
Uh,
matter of degree, though, right? Like, I think that, uh, I mean, I agree with you that it doesn't necessarily have to be about propositions, but I think more often than not, I think it is.
Well, so I think that might be our Western bias, right? So um, when we encounter religion, mostly as Westerners, it's Protestant Christianity or Western Latin Christianity in the Catholic Church, um, and in the Eastern Church, they they moved a little away from that kind of model, and their religious life is more embedded in practice,
Right.
um, and uh, when we're talking about how religion functions in society or what place religion might have, a lot of people want to make the conversation about, well, without religion, we wouldn't have any sense of morality. And I think that's ridiculous. Um,
Sure.
I think uh, we, we can get more into that in a second. Or they'll say that uh, religion needs to be the ultimate arbiter of truth. We can't listen to science or something like that. And I find that equally ridiculous. And so the question becomes, uh, if that's not what religion is doing or should do in society, uh, how do we? What place does it have? And that's kind of where we were getting to in some of our other conversations,
Sure.
because we were moving towards this thing where uh, really focused on existential experience being kind of the root and grounding of uh, a lot of things that we say and a lot of things that we do, and so in fact I think J Mike even asked one time, uh, what then at what point are you still religious if you're doing all these things, like if you're stripping these things away, at what point
I,
are you still religious?
I, I think also, like we're saying, I think it's hard to define because I agree with you that part of it is like practice and ritual, but even the term ritual, I think, is um, problematic because how are we defining ritual? Like, is it? I would think of a religious ritual as a ritual in the context of some existentialist mindset, if not a worship mindset. Because I'm reading some of the comments, like one could say that like our ritual is coming home. I think CJ wrote this in the comment section, like coming home and dropping his kids in a container every day every time he comes home,
Yeah.
or using the bathroom first thing in the morning. Like those, in a sense, are like ritualistic, but it's wouldn't
We
really
wouldn't
fit
call
the.
so scholars of religion wouldn't call those ritualistic. They would call them routine. Um,
So I guess, and where would be the distinction?
yeah. So I basically a ritual uh, would probably, for them to call it ritualistic, it would probably be it would. I think the caveat that they would put on that is that it is an intentional activity to form the community or the mind of form the mind of the community or the individual. Um, And so you have things like meditation, things like in the Christian tradition, communion, or these kinds of things. And so now, again, because religion is such this field is so hard to talk about. This is not like we're just being imprecise here.
Just difficult
It
to pin
is
down.
yeah, it is a even among experts in the field, which I'm not an expert in the field of religion in general. Um, I'm just an amateur in that field, but it is difficult for them to pin down, and so uh, it's tough. um, but the reason I think it's important to talk about what we're doing when we're engaging in religious practice is I think it relates a lot to uh, some of the things that we have talked about as uh, that become that have become problematic when we push on them, like if what is good. Oh no. I wanted to say something. I had a thought the other day because you guys asked me a question last time I was on here, and I had a really good way to say it. I couldn't think of it at the time, but you mentioned you asked because I talked about the divine and how our existential experience of the divine uh, is a motivating factor towards goodness. And you were trying to be like, what do you mean by divine? And I couldn't give you a good definition. Um, and I figured out a better way to say it without appealing to religious language. Um, it is the like Sam Harris, right? You have the best possible world and the worst possible world in his philosophical model, um, and you have a uh, you move towards one or the other. Uh, it doesn't matter what your opinion is about a particular act or activity, whether or not you think it will move you on
Right.
that.
Right.
It is a indisputable fact that your experience will call to you.
Right.
And so for me, uh, when I use words like we are called, uh, we are the transcendent, something transcendent calls to us. What I mean is kind of the set of all possible good experiences calls to us undeniably existentially, and we are moved by that. Um, and so the way this relates back to religion is, and I think it's a very good question, um, to avoid the pitfall of pure subjectivism. Uh, how do we begin to gain access to that set? By what mechanism do we start to critique our own understanding of the good? Or by what mechanism can we say that pursuing those things that are good in our estimation correlate to that reality? Um,
I guess. Yeah. I think I'm following you. I guess where I kind of, and maybe it's my own kind of baggage and the way the sound of religious language triggers me. It's like when you use words like transcendent, there seems to be kind of an inherent uh, uh, I, that sounds like a proposition, like
yeah, well,
the you
so
are
let me ask you a question this way. do you believe that the concept of good transcends the subjective individual?
In the sense that, uh, like you were saying earlier, I don't think that morality is dependent on subjective opinion. I think it's dependent on the nature of the mind itself. So in our experience, our conscious experience, what we call the qualia,
Yep.
that has a nature to it, and certain behaviors will lead closer to well-being, and certain behaviors will lead closer to suffering. But these are all things that can be understood on a kind of on a physical level. It's not something that I think is ultimately really metaphysical, and it's not something that I think, um, like, yeah, I mean, I think it transcends culture. I think it transcends, if that's what you mean by transcendent.
So I
Sure.
mean, so you would agree that what is good is not determined by an individual's opinion
Sure.
about a an experience. It is determined by the experience itself and the intrinsic tendency, well, the intrinsic fact that we don't value suffering,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Um, and that transcends the individual, right? That transcends uh, our opinions about right and wrong. That
Yeah, I agree
transcends
with that.
those things, and not only does it transcend us when we encounter things that maybe shake our opinions in that way. Uh, it is that transcendent good that irresistibly, I think, calls to us. We can't help but value uh, those that sort of thing. Um, and so my question is, uh, how do we move on that moral landscape? By what means do we uh, move from our subjective teeny tiny corner of moral understanding to having a better grasp of the set
Yeah.
of all that? And I think that uh, religious practice is one of the ways that human beings have concocted to make that move. So, not only religious practice, but also religious storytelling, um, where you have, uh, and we've talked about this a little bit in our other conversations, these symbolic worlds that uh, we encounter and uh, wrestle with and allow them to work on us, and we reject them and we accept them, and we do all sorts of different things with them. And then you also have things like meditation, things like uh, I mean, fill in the blank. The spiritual practice doesn't matter. It could be somebody in the comment, you mentioned them putting their keys in the tray every uh, every day. Um, if that, for instance, began to draw them towards, we don't want a chaotic life, we want an ordered life, and we want uh, things to be in their place. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to go with that, but
Well, I think in fact, he asked a secondary question there. He asked, "What if that behavior was bringing you peace?" As a kind of almost a meditative.
I mean, that might qualify it as a ritual
Right.
in religious, the idea of the religious scholars. But uh, what I'm getting at here is spirituality and religious stories and religious life and religious practice Uh, what I contend is that it is designed to draw us toward a higher place on the moral landscape.
Right.
And that, I think, is true independent of your theistic commitment. I'm an advocate for spiritual practice for atheists. I think that you would there is something to the idea of forming ourselves through behavior rather than proposition and convincing.
Right.
You know, in Christian circles, a lot of times they talk about when they're trying to evangelize somebody, they say, all right, we want to say, we're going to change your beliefs. We're going to say, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died for your sins to save you from hell? All right, we've changed your belief. You're on our team. Now you're going to belong in our community. And then, no, now you're going to just change your behavior. And then you can belong in our community. But if you look at the way that we learn as human beings, and we form ourselves as human beings, first, when we're born, we immediately will ideally belong with our parents. We have this sense of belonging. We are cared for. Then we start to behave. We act things out, things that we don't understand. We eat at the same time mom and dad do. We do all these things, and they become embodied in us. And then we form beliefs about those things.
Real quick, just to
Yeah.
clarify, by spiritual practice, you just mean engaging with the existential. Like, it's engaging in what you're describing as what will move us to that higher well-being, and you were calling that.
Say that again.
The religious practice or spiritual practice. I mean,
Okay.
You were defining that as kind of the behavior which will lead us to well-being, as opposed to suffering on the moral landscape.
I already have a little bit of an issue with that, but ask your question if you have a.
Well, I'm just looking at the comments here, and they're kind of the audience, I think, is a little unclear on how you're defining the terms, like how you're defining spiritual practice.
Yeah, so spiritual practice is just some sort of disciplined ritual that orients you toward the good, right? And it doesn't really matter what that is. It's one of those things that different religious traditions have different ways of doing it. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it orients you towards the good. And so, what was I saying? Oh, about belief and behavior and belonging. We often get it twisted. We often think that our behaviors flow from our beliefs. But if you look at human development and the way that we form cognition, a lot of things that we do, and a lot of things that we go through as human beings, they are formed pre-conscious, and then beliefs are formed to rationalize the behavior. And so the question is, well, how do we get to moral formation? Well, we embody it first.
So I'm of two minds about what you were saying, because on one hand, I agree with you. Like, I think that we have a lot of intuitions that then we kind of try to confirm by constructing ideologies and then constructing beliefs secondary to kind of just this feeling that's present, right? I wouldn't say that that's the case across the board, however. I think that there are situations, especially when you take something like fundamentalist uh, uh, fundamentalist interpretations of religion, where the individual might have certain moral intuitions or certain uh, intuitions in general about what they think is true about reality, that they actually suppress because they are kind of indoctrinated into a belief system that tells them this is the truth, and if you don't accept it, these are the consequences. A perfect example of this is, I'm sure you're familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah, sure.
And you're aware of one of the granddaughters who was a fundamentalist left that church and is now an atheist and a humanist, and she talks about her experience. Because a lot of people who are not fundamentalists have a hard time believing that people can actually believe in those propositions. That religious belief actually has consequences on behavior. And I think that it does. Like, I think, and not just religious beliefs, but I think beliefs in general. I think sometimes, like you said, I think sometimes there can be rationalizations for things that you already kind of happen to feel are true. But I don't think that's the case across the board. I think it depends on the specifics.
No, I think that's probably fair. But what I would say is, when it comes to the idea of belief, oftentimes I don't even think a lot of us are really aware of what we actually believe. We say things, and we say we believe things, but when it comes to, I can say, right, that I love my daughter, but if I beat her, do I really believe I love my do I really love my daughter? I uh or things like, no, that's the wrong way to go about this. Okay. What I would say to your idea that there are times where we are suppressing our moral intuition to conform to religious belief is that does occur. Um, but what I would say is that's not unique to religious belief.
Oh, I agree. I
That's
agree with that.
Yeah. And so uh, for for me, when I'm talking about religious systems and moral formation and how we instantiate beneficial practices to produce uh, moral people, um, I want to look at it through how do human beings actually learn? How do human beings actually form communal bonds? And from what we know from psychology is we embody things before we embody and act things out before we have a rational basis for them.
I, yeah, like I said, I think that is, to what degree that happens more, I'm uncertain. I think what you're saying is true, but I think it's half of the picture. Um, I agree with you that what I said isn't unique to religion, but I do think that what is unique to religion is kind of this defensiveness. I think you get some of that with politics as well, but especially more so, I think, with religion, um, because a challenge to religion or to religious ideas is a trigger to our existential fears, our fear of death, our fear of not seeing our loved ones again, our fear of not belonging to something that is bigger than ourselves, our fear of this being it. So while I agree that what I said earlier isn't unique to religion, I do think that I think it's harder. People want to hold their religious beliefs more often than not, kind of almost like immune to outside criticisms. Not obviously there are people that are religious but intellectual and don't do that and actually spend their time challenging themselves and challenging their ideas and having that dialogue. But when I'm thinking about like how the kind of the masses sort of experience these kind of things, I feel like there's almost like a knee-jerk reaction to like, if what I'm believing here isn't true, whether it starts out from an intuition or not, or some form of secondary belief formation, I think there's a real existential fear there. And I think we're talking about what the function of religion is. I think the one function that it has served, whether positive or negative, is in some way an attempt to cope with that existential fear.
I mean, that's the Marxist critique of religion, right? That it is the kind of opiate for humanity.
And I think I agree with that at least to some degree.
There are. I think that that is a fair critique of a lot of religious thinking, but what I see religion doing is something a little different than that. Because like if it's just an opiate, right? If it's just this thing to make us feel good about where we're about life after death, right? Or just to avoid confronting the idea of death, it's pretty hard to understand where concepts of eternal punishment come from, because that's not a super opiate oriented idea. Like you don't get hell as a bedtime story to make you feel better.
Right. So I do have an answer to that. And I do agree with you. I don't think the religion is just that. But I do think that aspect of religious doctrine is that it's a way to kind of, in a sense, establish order. And I think was put in place from people who probably knew better to control the masses. Hell is meant for other people.
No, so I do agree with that idea that when hell arises in the religious imagination, especially in the biblical text, it is meant for other people. However, it's not so much. This is one of the things that I think I actually will tell people this in my church, that the concept of hell in the Hebrew Bible does not arise until Babylonian captivity. You do not hear of any sort of idea of divine punishment until Babylonian captivity. And so what it seems to be is a reaction to bring comfort to a people who are suffering, right? That their oppressors will one day be oppressed, right? That's the idea. And so when this idea first shows up in religious thought, it is a comfort to the people. That's its primary function. Now, what happens is it moves from that thing that is supposed to comfort a suffering, oppressed people and gets put into the hands of the oppressors. And so,
I mean, it's just an expression, right, of our psychology. Like it's an expression of our wishful thinking. It's an expression of what we want to be true, but it's also an expression of our kind of tribalism. It's also an expression of our sense for community. Like it's an expression of many different things simultaneously.
Right. Well, and this is where I think religion actually has a really kind of unique function within culture. Is we talked about trying to orient ourselves toward the good, and we're trying to listen to the other, and we're trying to learn about that transcendent good through not only our own qualia, but also through the people around us. What religion does, I think, is invites us into a community of people where we're all wrestling with that, and then also gives the dead a voice, that we would learn from them and let them speak to us. And we do that through things like the biblical text itself, right? We get to see their values, their struggles, their lives. It functions as this kind of mirror as we can look into it. And so we ritualize, we dramatize, we do all these things to orient us towards the good. And the reason I think religion is particularly effective in that regard is because that's the kind of thing that we're biologically through our evolutionary history, we are biologically wired towards that kind of artistic, dramatic, relational thing. It's the same reason why people make billions of dollars in the movie industry. Like why Spider-Man sold a million bajillion tickets over the last few weeks. It's because we are wired towards that activity of
storytelling,
using these stories as this kind of these conversation partners and mirrors that we can examine ourselves, examine them, and not that we submit wholly to them. And if you look at religion, there is this kind of, well, I've said a lot there. I'll let you.
I'm trying to think about what you're saying, because I don't disagree, though I think that what you're describing is more what religion could be rather than what religion is. Like, I agree that, for some, there is that kind of, we're part of this community, but we're struggling with these ideas. We're kind of going through this kind of metaphorical process where we can still derive truth from the symbols and move us to a place that we feel maybe more complete than we were before. And this may be kind of based on the fact that I think I'm extremely jaded as far as the way I think people interact in the world. But I really do think that a lot of the time it's more, religious people tend to be more driven by this need to want to belong, but also this very human kind of tribalistic way. Like, yes, I belong to this community, but I'm in some way gonna look at the other I'm gonna say that I love the other, but simultaneously I'm going to reject everything about the other that doesn't fit or conform with my ideology as to what I think is the good, or what I think is the right way to live. And so I would love for religion to just be this kind of existential practice, divorced from propositions, and more as a tool to bring people together.
Well,
I don't think that's how it functions in the real world for the most part.
It really depends on what I will say is that I think that your observation that oftentimes religion is not used like this it's a fair observation, because I think a lot of especially Western Christianity became propositional. It took on that that form, and instead of being about something we've talked about, how uh, the cross is not a worldview. Um, we talked a little bit about that stuff in our last few conversations, and I can go over that if it'd be helpful for the chat. But um, that as they moved away from being a religious critique to being a systematic worldview, uh, they necessarily fell into the trap of dogmatism. And for me, religious practice isn't problematic at all. What's problematic is religious practice tied with dogmatism, and that's where I think we're probably in agreement on that dogma is generally the issue.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think a close parallel is politics.
Yeah.
But I think the difference is that I think it's harder to kind of break through those dogmas when they relate to things like an afterlife than it is when it's relating to things like just everyday life. Because there's always a kind of unfalsifiability when you're dealing with questions of life after death, or of there being beings or not beings or whatever, than like something like economic systems.
Right.
Even though I think
well, it's one of those reasons why I just think that when people want to talk to me about religion and they want to talk about supernatural elements of religious faith, I just am so bored by that conversation, because it's not really a conversation you can have. It's like you either believe this thing or you don't, and there's no way to epistemically justify it. And so for me, I find it much more helpful, and this is something we talked about, is not to have the conversation, this kind of existential moral conversation on the level of what you believe, because we've already talked about the particulars of what people's opinions are about we'll limit it to the good for the sake of conversation. They don't matter. What actually matters is, for me, not the what of belief, but the how of belief, the way the belief functions, and that is it's difficult to have that conversation with religious people, especially fundamentalist religious people, because they're concerned with, do you believe the right list of things because of a book? That's the way that they think.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I think of kind of the role of religion, I think when it first developed, I think it was a way to kind of try to answer questions that we were bombarded with, just in terms of just existing and not knowing what the hell was going on, and creating stories to try to make sense of the world. So I think it served a purpose. I think for the most part, the way it functions now, I think, is a detriment to society, as opposed to something that is positive. What you're describing, kind of this more existential approach that's not concerned with propositions, but it's concerned with, like, I agree with what you said earlier, right? Like, I think there's value in meditation for an atheist. I think
Right.
there's value in certain kinds of practices. There is a psychological benefit that's been proven to exist with those things. But when I think of religion and how it functions, that I don't think that is the way that it's functioning for the most part.
So is it religion? Does that the guilt of those negative things that you're seeing in religion lay at the feet of religion, or does it lay at the feet of dogma? That's my question.
I think I would say it's lays at the feet of religious dogma, which I think is it takes up the majority of the way that I think religion functions in society. Like I think what you're describing is a far more uh, intellectual, philosophical, and existential um, kind of an embodiment of how we how would I say this, engage with life, uh, which is great. Like I mean, I think that's philosophy. Like I think what you're doing is not much different than just having a philosophical mindset, um, and and valuing existentialism as a way to kind of understand our place in the world. I think those are all great things, and I think some, if their way to express that is through certain kinds of rituals or certain kinds of religious language, I don't even necessarily have a problem with that. What I don't think is the case and I'm not saying you're claiming this, but I've met people who have said that this is the case for the majority of religious people. That this is what they're doing when they're engaging in religion, and I think that's demonstrably not true. And I'm not even just looking at the fundamentalists. I'm looking at the majority of people who call themselves by a religious label. One, probably don't know the books that they're abiding
Yeah,
by.
Christians don't read the Bible. That's
Yeah,
yeah.
and two, it's more, again, I think it's more driven by not so much as a means to create or again, like I said earlier, I think it's coming out of fear more so than anything else.
the, the way that I see uh, well, let's put it this way. If you talk to uh, the average Japanese person, right, in Japan, they will not call themselves religious. They'll
Right,
say that they're atheist, um, but then they'll also go to a Shinto shrine and fill out a talisman, pay money to the temple, and place it on the wall. What's going on there?
right.
What do you like? What what do you think is going on? That they deny that they're religious. They deny that they believe these things, but then you see these behaviors. Uh, what do you think's going on in a situation like that?
I think it depends. Yeah, I think it depends on the individual, and I think it depends on the ideology. Like I think that for some, it is just that there is kind of this, for whatever reason, this positive feeling that arises from just engaging with ritual in general. I think for
Okay,
some,
where you talked about that positive feeling of engaging in ritual. Um, I agree that that's a thing that that happens, and so what what I guess when we're talking about forming belief uh, and engaging in moral reasoning and where religion fits in that, or maybe let's talk about, maybe since you're not convinced that religion does function in that way, how religion should function.
right,
Um,
right,
so for me, from what we know about the science of cognition, uh, that a lot of who we are is embodied before we can rationalize, and that we can train our minds with brain plasticity, all sorts of things, to resonate in certain directions. We form communities and rituals and tell stories to orient minds towards the good, and regardless, I think, of whether you are an atheist or a theist, you are engaged in that.
I think one question is, are those things actually orienting us towards the good? I think it would be the one question.
Well, so I would say that, and it's something that you might agree with this, that we existentially experience the call toward the good. And so why do we feel good when we go and watch Spider-Man? Well, there's something in that story, or in those characters, or in the special effects and the artistry of it, that calls us towards something good. And I mean, we could even call, for me, going to the movie is kind of a religious experience, right? I get popcorn every time I go because it hits the senses like incense does in a temple. There are religious, we are engaged in religious systems as human beings, and I don't think there's a way to get around it. What we can do, and I think we should do, is reject
the propositional dogmatic.
The dogmatic elements of religious practice.
I understand what you're saying. I think that I think this partially goes back to what we said in the beginning, right? Like, I almost fear that, and I'm seeing some of this sentiment expressed in the comments, that just kind of defining religion this way is almost so such a wide definition. Like, anything that is ritualistic and gives us the sense of peace or well-being could be called religious. Almost seems like you're almost including such a wide variety of experience that it's almost like, well, you're just kind of saying that almost everything in a sense is religious.
Yeah, I can see how that might be problematic, and that does go a little bit down to the problem of the definition of religion itself. But I would say that, I mean, there's a little bit of magical thinking that goes on in even in very kind of rationalistic, atheistic mind, right? So we mentioned the keys, right? Well, I put my keys in this thing because it gives me a sense of peace. Well, why? Why? We fetishized this kind of this action. Why does? I mean, there is. I don't think it's so simple to say that we could just apply the label religious to any activity.
No, right. No, I'm not saying any activity, but I do think that there is some ambiguity there. Just real quick, and I don't want to kind of get too stuck on this.
Sure.
But I do want to respond to a comment that was posted. Otangelo says, if there's no God, there's also no real objective moral law. Moral law is conceptual, not material. It requires a mind to explain its existence. There is no such law. There's no such thing as evil or good. Ergo, when the befuddled atheist invokes a problem of evil as an argument against God, they're automatically contradicting their own atheism. I mean, this is...
Yeah, no.
Otangelo, this is like... It's just ignorance to what moral realism and the traditional moral realism is. Like, no, it's not immaterial. The moral law is a way to kind of express facts that are true about our conscious experience. Suffering and well-being are real experiences that we can point to in the material world And when we're talking about morality, we're describing what behaviors will lead towards the good or towards well-being as opposed to towards suffering. And while, yes, this may be experienced by subjects, the point here that I think we both agree on is that there is an objective nature to the mind. And I don't mean just human mind, but to the mind of just being a conscious being. And so subjective opinion isn't what matters. What matters is what is the nature of this thing. The fact that you think, Angelo, that this can't exist unless some God being exists and says this is the good thing, it's just you don't understand philosophy.
Yeah, well, and I want to point out that this what you're talking about, it's not just that the experiences themselves are valuable, right? It's that we cannot help but value those experiences. Now, what gives us those experiences will be different, like subjective,
right,
the qualia of particular things will be, but that phenomenon and whatever causes that phenomenon to occur in us, that phenomenon is the same, and that is objective, and it does not require a supernatural agent.
And it would also, right, and it will be subjectively different, but on a spectrum. Like not so subjectively different that somebody could, kill somebody and reach the same kind of state of well-being and goodness that I'm describing is a state of being. Like, I think that's where the confusion for a lot of people is well, if it's subjective, then what stops somebody from saying, like, oh, I'm going to kill somebody. That makes me feel good. So that's moral. Like, that's not what's being said here. Just like, we can have different taste in food, but there's a difference between food and drinking bleach. Like there is, yeah. There's a difference there, a qualitative difference that we can talk about.
Yeah, that is I think one of the Christian virtues that Christians consistently fail to demonstrate is charity. And what I mean by that is they do not know how to listen to a position charitably.
And that's a dogmatism, right? Like that's someone like him. He's so indoctrinated that it's like he's just constructed this barrier to any kind of other position that, like you said, it's just not.
And as a pastor, if that person is a Christian, I can say that is antithetical to Christian charity, and you should repent.
Right.
But that is this is very when it comes to talking about the role of religion, I don't think there's a place in society where we can get by without some sort of thing like religion. But I do think that there are problematic religions, or maybe problematic forms of religions, and that includes Christianity. There are problematic forms of Christianity. And that we need to wrestle with those, and we need to even expose those. When it comes to conversations like ours, where we're trying to really dig into this deep concept, it can sometimes be easy to lose sight of the fact that, when it comes to most issues, I would probably say that we're probably on the same team
sure.
on most of those issues.
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, I think that your perspective. I think you're navigating this tradition that you've been a part of, right?
Right.
but I think that you're far closer to someone who's doing existentialist philosophy, and I think you're essentially you're an atheist that finds value in certain types of language and traditions, and I think you've reinterpreted religion in a way that I think if everybody was engaging with these questions and with the symbolism in the way that you are, we would live in a far better world than we do.
Yeah.
My concern is that this isn't the way that religion functions the majority of the time.
Well, and it's a concern of mine too. But I will say for the record that I do identify as a theist, just not a theist towards kind of the fundamentalist notion of God. Um, you would probably call me an atheist because you would want to reduce um, these things that we're talking about that are
As belief in propositions and like beings and stuff.
Yeah. But oh, you said something that triggered something in my brain, and I completely forgot. You were talking about religion, and
religion doesn't function the way that we would hope it should.
Yeah. Well, and so one of the things I think is really helpful about you talk about navigating my tradition. I'll tell you the reason. One of the reasons that I didn't leave my tradition when I deconstructed my faith was within the tradition itself. I found the concept of religious critique, and so for me, the idea of pushing back against dogma is not anti-religious. It's part of my tradition. And I see this demonstrated in the biblical text itself, right? So we have things like in Genesis chapter 1, you have a creation story. And in Genesis chapter 2, you have another creation story. And they are separated in authorship by centuries. The first one uses a whole bunch of Babylonian imagery and Babylonian mythology to paint a particular picture of God in the universe. And the other one uses a whole bunch of Egyptian mythology and imagery to paint a particular image of God in the universe. And they're stuck right next to each other, and they contradict each other, not only in terms of just how the stories happened, but also the picture they're painting of God. And so in the very first two chapters, what you see is this conversation going on? Is this putting forward of this is what I think it means to live in the world and be human and relate to each other and relate to the divine and all these things. And then you have in the very next chapter, well, here's a different one, and they're all put together in the same book. This is why when people say things like the Bible says X or the God of the Bible is X, I'm like, that's not a thing. That's not how it works.
Would you think? Do you think it's fair to say that? I don't know. It seems to me like both interpretations. Like I agree with what you're saying, that there is this conversation, right? That it's almost you're being called to in certain the way that the Bible's put together. You're being called to have that conversation.
Yeah.
But then there are. It does seem to me that there are parts of the Bible that are kind of stating things as like this is the case.
Yeah, well, and I think those for me, those sections are part of the conversation, right? And that doesn't.
I guess my question is that found in the tradition, or is it that is it more about like the tradition itself, or is it about the person reading the text and kind of how they're interpreting it as like, is it more of like I'm not saying that I believe one way or another, but it seems to me like it could be just the case that you recognize the contradictions in a way that other religious people don't, and so you interpret it in this different way.
Yeah, well, I will say one of the I think the primary mistake that religious Christians make when reading the Bible is presuming univocality. That when they come to the text, they expect all of this book that's written over centuries by hundreds of different authors
To have like a clear message.
yeah, to have one single thing to say, and that I think if you don't go to the text with that presumption, you will never come away from it with it,
With that,
because
okay.
it's so clear that these are people who are in different contexts trying to say different kinds of things uh, about God as they wrestle with what it means to be a people, be a family, be a human,
Right.
and they're trying to wrestle with the divine. And so for me, the elements of the Bible that are problematic, well, I look at those and I see, well, this is a certain set of people in a certain culture, in a certain circumstance, who are trying to tease out what it means to be good, what it means to follow the transcendent call. And
Two questions real quick, if
yeah,
that's okay. One, I still fail to understand how orienting towards the good necessitates anything spiritual, given demonstrations of fairness, equality, and altruism throughout the animal kingdom. How does Bryan rule out natural evolutionary causes for near universal intuitions in order to claim that the good is transcendent?
I definitely wouldn't rule those things out, right?
Okay.
So I think it is very, very possibly the case that this is purely the result of naturalistic processes. But what I would say is that even though it is the case that we have these things baked into our biology, it is the case that these things are baked into our biology, and we shouldn't neglect them.
Sure, sure. And another question. I think Bryan could study some psychopaths, serial killers. He would easily demonstrate that not all humans value well-being. So I think that from my perspective, I think there's an error there
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
being made. Because it's not that the serial killer. I think part of it is that some people just, because of their unfortunate biology, don't have access to certain states of experience. But it's not that they're necessarily.
it's the idea as if they had access
They
to
would
that,
value it.
they
That
could
they would
not
value.
help but value. Yeah,
And that's the thing
yeah,
that I feel like a lot of criticisms of more realist. They don't understand that observation. Like
right.
somebody in the moment, an addict can value getting their next fix, right? But if they could have access to the experience of not being addicted to drugs, they would value that intrinsically. And it's not like these psychopaths or serial killers who do harm to other people are like living these happy lives, or wouldn't care about living happier lives in exchange for just a momentary fix. It's
Right.
just I think.
And so for me, religion is kind of a tool to try and get access to that larger set of experiences that maybe we don't understand in the other. And it is a tool that can and has been very misused. But
Sure.
yeah.
I'm trying to see if there's any other questions in the chat. Yeah, I think there. Bradley says, if they're baked into our biology, then by definition they aren't transcendent.
Yeah, I mean, I think transcendent is a relative term, right? So, like, what does it transcend? Well, it transcends the subjective whims of the individual.
Right.
Right.
I think this is the problem with using those words, though. They have such baggage that, I do, like, I often wonder if it's not better to use different language just to not kind of muddy the waters.
I mean, so maybe a better way to say it is because what I'm talking about as transcendent here is the concept of the good, that and that these spiritual practices kind of orient ourselves towards them, and those spiritual practices are not based on some sort of supernatural thing, but that
yeah, like,
right.
Yeah, I don't think you're saying that these things are transcend the physical realm.
Right.
I think.
And so perhaps it might be better to, instead of use transcendent, to talk about this concept of the good, we could say it's so hard for me to find another word. Non-arbitrary.
Right.
It's because that is what it does. It transcends the individual and calls the individual.
Right.
And that call is experienced existentially.
Right.
It's very much a kind of a Kierkegaard way of looking at the idea of what it means to pursue goodness and that leap into faith that he talks about. But I wouldn't link it to anything supernaturally metaphysical like that.
Right. I mean, it sounds like we ground our morality in the same thing, essentially.
Very similar things, yes. I just think the formation of the social self is, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of the social self, and the formation of the social self is influenced by religious practices, whether or not we are aware of them. So my contention is that, well, we should be aware of them so we can know how we're being formed. And that's kind of how I would say that, because I think that it is a great religious practice, and religious storytelling are great tools to try and shape our way of moving in the world in a way that goes towards the good, if it's done well. If it's done badly, if it's done dogmatically, if it's done abusively, there's so many ways it can go wrong. And so I think a logical question would be, well, if there's so many ways that this can go wrong, why engage it in the first place? Well, my contention is you have to. You can't escape that. There's no way to fully escape it.
I think partially it's like an issue of semantics here. Like, I don't know. Like, if you want to call that kind of conversation or kind of journey a religious one, I understand why you would do that. I think for me, I would just call it more of an existential and philosophical one. And so whether that ends up relating to any kind of religious ritual or tradition, or if it's just something else. I'm not sure. I mean, I do agree that I think most people engage in some form of ritual. I don't know that I would call those rituals, or I would think of those in the same way that I would think of religious ones. But again, it could just be that I'm using a different definition for religion than the way it's being framed. So like I'm not so like triggered by the language to where it's like, oh, I hear religion and then like I just, I cringe out of what you're saying. Like I think that's what you're saying is fair. I think ultimately what we're both arguing for is valuing an existential framework to understand our place in the world and to understand how to orient ourselves towards the good. And, if for somebody, the way of doing that is, following certain kinds of rituals and using certain kinds of religious language, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Well, and that's, and for me, vice versa. If somebody wants to fully root this in kind of a secular humanist agenda, and they want to pursue community through that lens and wants to do that, I think that is a good thing, right?
Right.
But it is. I don't think that the secular humanist can say that they escape the process of religious formation, and it might be that we're just using religion in two different ways.
Yeah, I think they just would say they wouldn't call it religious. They would call it maybe existential. They would call it.
Well, they just call it cultural, probably
cultural, or I think at that point, I think the sound doesn't really, the word doesn't really matter, right? I think it's more like what is it that ultimately we're doing when we're engaging with the other or engaging with ourselves in the world? What is it that's taking place? And so but can you still see me? Because I think
yeah, I can see you.
Okay, because my computer is freezing up for some reason. So if I disappear for a minute, I'll be right back.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
It should be fine. But I just did want to reply to something real quick. It's not going to let me show the comment because my computer is being weird.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Something that Angelo wrote about scientists don't support the idea that morality comes from consciousness. It's completely false. Like, yeah, the hard problem of consciousness exists, and we may be.
Nope, there he goes. There he goes. Hey guys, it's just me now. I'll wait for Cease to get back on. But I'll go ahead and look at some of y'all's questions while he's trying to get back on. Oh, there he is.
Sorry, my computer just crashed for some reason. This has been happening all literally. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry about that. And I'm not echoing or anything?
No, you're good.
Okay. So I was just going to say, the problem, the hard problem of consciousness exists. That's not an issue for moral realism. Regardless of how consciousness forms, there is no reason to assume that it's still not a physical process, or that at least it doesn't entail certain aspects of experience in the world. Like the states of well-being and suffering can still be described in physical terms, even if maybe those terms don't completely encapsulate the phenomenon.
Yeah. One of the things that I really hate, sorry, I have to plug in my computer 1 sec. It's starting to die.
No problem.
One of the things that I hate that Christians will do is pretend that the Bible gives them some sort of insight into reality and ontology
Right.
that science just couldn't deal with. Like that. It's like, oh, well, I know where consciousness comes from because I read a book. It's
Right.
like, no, you don't. You don't know that.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much evidence for the way moral beliefs are formed just through evolutionary psychology and that kind of thing. Like, the way that empathy has developed, the way that working together with other with the other, something that we observe in nature. So again, this is just sort of just not understanding the way the world works. I'm going to ask if do you guys have any other questions for us before we close up here? Just because my computer's
No, it's good.
kaput
I'm
at the
just going to
moment.
kind of scroll through. I have the chat open here. I want to scroll through because I
Yeah,
saw
and
something.
also we're passing the hour and a half mark.
Yeah.
But like, the other one by really fast. I always appreciate when you can come on and have these conversations. Well, of course, we'll have you back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come back. And I'd love to sometime. I know we talked a little bit about maybe doing it this next time, but I think that trying to talk about the role of religion and maybe where the real problem is was a better conversation to have. But I thought maybe next time we might discuss some of these biblical things where we have to say that this is a conversation, and to try and reduce it to one voice will just be incoherent. And
Right.
so that would be a fun conversation to have. I did see CJ said something about the idea that religious practices orienting us towards the good being a tautology, and I don't understand that criticism. So
yeah, I'm not sure. It seems more like a definition, right? Like,
yeah, I'm
I'm
not sure
not
I
sure what
understand that criticism.
the one question I did see here, you're being asked how you stand to divine command theory.
I think divine command theory is a morally deficient defense of dogma, actually.
Right. Right.
That divine command theory is things are good because my book says they're good.
Right.
And well, one, I think it's demonstrably false because the book contradicts itself on what's good.
Right.
And then also that I think existential rootings of morality are just it makes things a lot more simple. You don't need to invent a supernatural metaphysic to explain a lot of the things that we just intuit. So I just think it's just a bad idea.
Real quick, can you guys in the audience, can you still hear me okay? Just I'm always worried when I'm doing this from my phone, and I apologize for the consistent tech issues. Hopefully I will have a better functioning computer for this real soon. The one other question that was asked, how are you not making a trivial statement when you say that you think religious practices help us move towards the good, since according to you, religious practices are defined as practices that move us towards the good?
So I wouldn't say that religious practice. This is how I would put it. Religious practices are ritualistic actions or communal actions or uh, image symbolic filled actions like storytelling, those kinds of things. And they are, I think what I'm trying to say here is not that religious practices are practices that orient us towards the good. I'm saying religious practices do orient us towards the good, and religious practices can be all kinds of things. Is kind of what I would.
So, like you're saying,
say.
um, it doesn't necessarily orient us towards the good, but when it's successful, it's what it's trying to do.
Yeah, so it is a set of any kind of ritualistic symbolic action that orients the human being towards the good, and that is kind of that's a descriptive statement of those things. And so to distinguish it from brushing my teeth in the morning gives me better teeth, therefore I'm pursuing health, therefore I'm pursuing a higher state of being. Religious practice is, I think, symbolically removed from the actual thing that you're trying to accomplish. So, like, for instance, when we go to a movie, right, we are challenged with these images and stories that call us to be better. That's removed from what's actually going on in the room. The ontology of what's actually going on, like it is through our experience of that event that calls us to something else. And so it's kind of that thing, if that makes any sense. It's hard to articulate.
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. I do think there's some issue there, linguistically. I worry that it may be kind of too open-ended. But I think I get what you're saying. We'll definitely revisit this as well next time we come on. I think it would be a better way of saying it would be that that most of us have an existential call towards the good, towards wanting to establish a community, towards connection in some meaningful and kind of deep-rooted way, and that there are certain behaviors, ritualistic and otherwise, that go along with that.
Well, and I think the important thing to talk about to make something cultic or religious in its practice here is it is not the thing that you're doing, right? It is not. I'll give you an example from Christianity, right? So when you take the Eucharist, communion, what you're doing is eating bread and drinking wine. That's what you're doing.
Right.
But that thing is orienting you towards some existential reality that is outside of that thing. And it's not just the experience of eating bread and drinking wine, but it's the experience of the intentionality to move yourself towards something that is outside of yourself. It is well, outside of yourself might not be the right way, but that is beyond your own moral intuition. Um, it's very hard to articulate, and it's one of the
Beyond
reasons
your own
why
what?
beyond your own individualistic moral intuition. Um, and so it is.
I do
It's tough.
wonder what something like the Eucharist is orienting you. Like you were talking about kind of an external existential reality, and I wonder what that means exactly. Like, especially if it's something that's kind of divorced um, from propositions. Uh, Again, is it just like the kind of the fulfilling of kind of a sense of community that's taking place, or just kind of the sense of ritual that's.
Ask me that again. Ask me that again.
So when when people are engaging in eating the bread and drinking the wine,
Mm-hmm.
um, you were saying that is not so much about the action itself, but kind of the symbolic. Uh, you're saying that it's kind of orienting the individuals towards this existential reality. And I guess what I'm trying to clarify is, do you mean kind of this feeling of connection just through the very fact that you're engaging in a ritual? Is it just a sense of community that you're sharing this action with other human beings? What is it? What is this existential reality you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it can kind of be a variety of things just by the nature of it being existential, right? So, uh, that ritual is designed to uh, call you into a more genuine and honest pursuit of uh, your good, the good of the community, all sorts of things. But what makes it religious is it's a concrete action that is rooted in the imaginary and symbolic world that we intend to form us.
Right.
Um, and that is, uh, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, I think it does.
Um,
I think it does. And yeah, well, this is definitely a conversation that I want to continue as well. I think we've hit on a lot of. I think we're just scratching the surface, but I think we hit on a lot of important concepts here. I mean, I hope you feel like we made progress as to the conversation that you were looking to have, right?
yeah, no, we hit a lot of those high points.
We can definitely next time you're on talk more about the role of religion. I think we did it to a degree. I think there's definitely more to say there.
Yeah, for sure, for
Um,
sure.
but yeah, I always enjoy our conversations. I'm glad that we could set this up, and we'll try to have you back sooner rather than later, because I think
That'd
these
be
are
great.
and as always, everybody listening in, thank you for tuning in. If you want to support what we're doing, patreon.com/axioms on trial. And always, just like and subscribe. And um, I think that we'll be back. I think in a couple of days. Uh, um, I want to do an episode responding to some comments and also some blog posts that I read um, relating to a conversation that I had in here. So having said that, I'm gonna try to see if I can even. How do I do this? I'm doing this from my phone, so it's a little bit confusing. But is there anything else you want to say before we head out here?
Yeah, I would say that if you are somebody who wants to uh, have some sort of if you want to grow as a person, whether you are theistic or atheistic, I would recommend in making some intentional practices in your life to orient yourself toward good things. Take time to meditate. Take time to do those things, because it scientifically it makes a difference.
Right.
And it is important, I think, that we are intentional about how our minds are formed so that we can value the proper things. And so that's my 2 cents at the
Perfect.
end.
No, I'm definitely with you on that. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. It's good to see some familiar faces. And yeah, we'll be back soon. So everyone take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.